Guess what? Probation is recommending a lengthy sentence for Elizabeth Holmes. And how do I know that? Listen to this. And this is in the defense's sentencing memo just filed with the court. If ever a person is to receive credit for the good she has done and her immediate conduct assessed in the context of her overall life, it should be at the moment of her sentencing. Keep listening. When her very future hangs in the balance, described by over 130 letters as a compassionate, honest, and humble woman, Elizabeth Holmes, compassionate, honest, and humble woman with much to give to the world and a deep commitment to doing so, Miss Holmes' personal history and characteristics strongly counsel against a lengthy incarceration. That means to me that the probation department is recommending to the judge a lengthy prison time for Elizabeth Holmes. But what does Elizabeth Holmes want? And I'm going to walk you through the sentencing memo. She's recommending to the court that she gets 18 months or less because she's asking for a downward departure from the sentencing. And she's asking for home detention. No prison. Elizabeth Holmes is recommending the judge give her no prison time for defrauding, for conspiring with Balwani to defraud investors and to defraud 3 investors to the tune of over $144 million. And Elizabeth Holmes says the appropriate sentence is 18 months or less of home detention and community service. All right, so in this video, I'm going to talk to you about the reasons why, and I think these reasons are going to backfire big time against Elizabeth Holmes. I'm going to walk you through her motion. I'm going to point out some things. We're going to look at her reasons why. We're going to look at the law, because you know me, I like to go through what the law says. And I'm going to tell you really, more importantly, what's missing, what's not in this memo, and whether or not it'll have an impact on her appeal and the likely outcome. So, hi there, I'm Michele Hagan. I'm a legal analyst and a former prosecutor. You may recognize me because I provided a lot of legal analysis on the Elizabeth Holmes case and the Sunny Balwani case. And this video is simply my opinion. It's for education information. And thank you to all of those of you who have subscribed. Please do support my work by subscribing. Hit that like button and share these videos. And I want to know what your analysis is. So please leave a comment or question, and I'm going to get to your questions. Thank you to many of those of you who have submitted questions. I'll address those questions. We'll get to those. And stay with me because it's an 82 memo. I tried to knock it down quite as much as I could and just point out, highlight the parts that I thought were important. So stay with me because we're going to learn a lot. You know, is Elizabeth Holmes able to get a job? Does she have any money? Does she have any money to pay restitution? We're going to talk about those things and why she thinks 18 months or less is appropriate for what she has been convicted of. All right, so let's get to it. Now, in case you popped on this channel, Elizabeth Holmes was convicted in January of 2022 of 4 counts. 4 wire fraud counts, they're felonies. 1 conspiring with Sunny Balwani, a co-defendant. They were charged separately. He was convicted of all counts. She was convicted of just 4 counts. 1, the conspiracy to defraud investors with Balwani, and 3 counts of individually defrauding investors in the blood testing company that she started called Theranos. Went to trial. She was convicted on 4 counts. All right, this is the sentencing. The sentencing will take place on November 18th. Both sides have an opportunity to submit what's called a sentencing memo. So I'm gonna walk you through her sentencing memo, the one that she submitted, the recommendation that she's making to the court. We don't have the prosecution's recommendation yet, their sentencing memo, and we're not going to see what the pre-sentence report says because those reports are confidential. You can go ahead and take a look at the prior video I did on will Elizabeth Holmes speak at sentencing? And again, I think this is another reason why she's going to speak at sentencing, and it has to do with something that's missing in this sentencing memo that she filed with the court. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at the memo. I'm going to walk you through it, and you can make your own analysis. And so get a good cup of coffee or tea and hang with me on this one. All right, so this should be, all right, so it was filed on late on Thursday on November 10th. This says Ms. Holmes sentencing memorandum and motion for downward departure. That means she wants even less time of home detention. All right, and it's a public redacted version. So a lot of it has been redacted out, the black lines that have drawn through things. So I'm not going to be going through, obviously, those many pages, but I'm going to point out the highlights here. And this is kind of give you an overview of the topics that she's addressing. And this relates to the 7 factors that a judge considers when sentencing a defendant. All right. So number 1 is her personal history and characteristics. There's information about her childhood, her college, CEO of Theranos, her relationship with Balwani, which of course she alleges abuse and points the finger at Balwani for a lot of this, as she did in the trial. And in this memo, her current family life, her volunteer work. Then we get into the personal characteristics. She has a deep interest in making the world a better place. Caring and reliable friend. A lot of this is in the 130 letters. You know, caring, reliable. She's honest. She's an advisor, a mentor. She's an intelligent. She's a visionary. She has a positive impact on others. And then here's the part that I've been calling out. This is going to be the beef or the battle is over how the judge calculates the sentence. And I went over this in you can go ahead and take a look at the very first video I did on this channel, which was calculating the sentence for Elizabeth Holmes. And we'll take a look at the sentencing table and I'll show you the difference. I'll get to that. And I hope I'm not talking too fast. All right. So regarding, she's objecting to how the loss is calculated in the pre-sentence report, which is the loss calculation determines which range, how much time you're facing as far as your sentence. All right. So she's objecting, saying, you know, the prosecution can't show that certain conduct by clear and convincing evidence relates to certain crimes. You know, each investor and associated loss must be considered separately. These are her arguments. The entirety of each investment is not appropriate. The gain, you know, they're claiming that Ms. Holmes didn't have any gain through her activities. We'll talk about that too. And asking for the downward departure. And you notice here all the redaction here. This is along the lines of, it's throughout this motion. All right. The reason they reject it is because it's confidential information, or for some reason it's sensitive and they don't want disclosed to the public. All right. She's also objecting to how the probation department determine the number of victims. And that matters because the more victims there are, the more you can increase the steps. And the farther you go down the scale, the more exposure you're looking at for prison time. All right. And she's also objecting to, and I pointed this out before, you can go ahead and take a look at my video I did on, I think it's 3 ways to increase her sentence. That would be increasing her role. Is she considered a leadership role? If so, she gets, I think it's 4 additional steps. So it goes down that scale. All right. The other thing is this is a plea for substantial leniency. According to Elizabeth Holmes, according to this motion, she's basically saying to the judge, I should be treated differently because of the following reasons. 1, it's a unique world of investments and startup companies. You know, she took a big risk, according to many of these letters, on behalf of letters in support. I call them character letters. you know, as saying that she's an honest person, she's a humble person, she's trying to do good. You know, she had a lot of courage, took a high risk here, dropped out of Stanford and started Theranos. All right, you make the call on this one. Innovative technology, number 2. Number 3, even though the fraud took place, they're claiming that because Theranos still had retained a substantial value, I guess she should get leniency for that. I don't know, but she's also claiming she can't pay restitution. All right, number 4. The circumstances show Ms. Holmes to be a founder and CEO deeply committed to the company's mission rather than her own personal gain. They argued throughout she never sold any stock. Well, my response to that is, if you sell the stock, you lose control of the company. Okay, so all right, just my opinion here. Number 5, because of their extreme focus on the loss, the guidelines are unhelpful. They're claiming, I'm sorry for laughing here, but they're claiming that the federal sentencing guidelines are unhelpful to the judge. Therefore, judge, throw them out. Do what you want, judge. Really? Isn't that being asked to be treated differently? All right, number B. Her personal history and characteristics strongly support leniency along the lines of what I started this video with, that whole statement. And C, incarceration is not necessary for Ms. Holmes to afford her an adequate deterrence and to protect the public. We'll get into that too. Just punishment, and here again, shows again to me, validates that probation is recommending a lengthy incarceration. Because look at number D, justice, punishment, respect for the law are not served by a lengthy incarceration. Okay, so going to prison is not going to serve. All right. All right. So anyway, they're arguing that she should get significant community service for defrauding investors out of 144 million, putting patients at risk, misrepresenting that the technology was fair, accurate, reliable, and cheap. People were walking in to Theranos wellness centers and Walgreens, getting their blood tested and relying on the results. And she should get significant community service for that. Okay, you know, I defended cases too. I prosecuted cases, I defended cases, I've trained a lot of attorneys. I don't think this memorandum is going to be helpful to Ms. Holmes. Just my opinion. All right, so let's get into the thick of it here. What are they saying here? Oh, and I wanted to point this out to you. These are articles that they put in the memo. Prison does not reduce recidivism. Coercive control and intimate partner violence. You know, in other words, the Balwani, the abuse that she endured, alleged abuse that she endured, she was not able to make sound decisions. Is that what they're arguing? Look at under line C, why the federal sentencing guidelines should be scrapped. You're saying this to a federal judge? And keep in mind, this judge is no fool. He's been on the bench for a long time. And prior to him being on the federal bench, if I did my research correct, he was a public defender. And then he went into private practice and he did criminal defense work. So, I mean, this memo, who's your audience? Who's doing the sentencing? The sentencing is the judge. All right. So is this going to play well to the judge or to any judge? Silent suffering, the need for a better understanding of partner sexual violence. I get it. Okay. I prosecuted domestic violence, child abuse cases, child molest cases. I get it. Okay. It's a terrible, terrible tragedy to be in a domestic violence, to be in a toxic, to be in an intimate partner relationship, to be even, you know, she alleges that she was raped at college. Terrible. It's devastating. It's devastating to her life. And now she's a certified rape counselor. Okay, and I'll get to that too. And you go ahead and look at these articles that they cite. What does that tell you about what they're saying to the judge? All right, so here's the facts. You know, Ms. Holmes was 19. She was just 34 when the company tanked, or when the fraud was discovered, I should say. She worked tirelessly. She tried to improve access to affordable health information. Great. Noble intention. She's trying to change the world. I get it. Okay. But the question is, did she lie? Did she make misrepresentations? Fair, accurate, reliable technology relating to people's health. The jury found that she committed fraud. Okay. People invested in her company. People put hundreds of millions of dollars in her company based on her running around the world making these presentations, right? That this was a great thing, great concept, okay? But did it work? Still issuing, they're saying here under, look at line 9 and 10, the company achieved incredible valuable inventions for which the United States government is still issuing patents. Right, I understand patents. Patents, design patents, okay, but did the technology work? She suffered substantial trauma throughout the time period of the offense. I think that relates to her relationship with Balwani, where she alleges abuse. When criticisms arose, she committed fully to identifying, acknowledging, and fixing the errors. Did she? Did she? She never cashed out. She went down with the ship. Well, that's not the test. You don't have to have a monetary gain. It's a question of whether you lied, you committed fraud. And besides which, in this memo, it says the defense says that she took over 1.5 million in salary over 6 years. So what is that? 250,000 or so a year. Well, she had a lifestyle that she was maintaining. Just because you didn't cash in the stock doesn't mean you didn't gain. That's something I would argue. Then they say, and regardless of the sentence of the court imposes, for the rest of her life, she and her family will be punished. As her partner knows all too well, there is no avoiding the scorn that accompanies Elizabeth Holmes. No doubt about it. She has been targeted. There's been vitriol. And believe me, I've gotten plenty of comments on my channel. I get it, okay? But I want to say something here that's very sensitive. You know, for the rest of her life, she and her family will be punished. I mean, it's a terrible, terrible tragedy for her family. But she also brought 2 children. I understand that she's currently pregnant. Also, you know, are going to have a lifetime of explaining who their mother is, okay? And again, you know, I prosecuted child abuse, molest cases, so I pay attention to these things, all right? It's her decision to make, but look what was going on at the time, okay? And they're saying, you know, the defense is saying she needs to be treated as a human being. What's been portrayed in the media is a caricature that's been mocked and vilified. That's true, okay? Generally, I think some of it's true. Certainly can be argued it's true. But she also testified in front of a jury for 7 days. She also was there throughout the trial as a defendant. Okay? So I don't know if that's going to be helpful here. These are the people who know Miss Holmes, all those letters, all the people that have supported her, you know, that love and support her. But the question is, did she commit fraud, and what's the just sentence here? So these are the people that know Miss Holmes and her character, remorse, and capacity to do good. Okay, her character, right? She's, you know, a kind-hearted person according to them. She's compassionate, she's humble, she's honest, she's a risk taker, she's an innovative thinker, etc. She's a visionary. Where's the remorse? I didn't see the remorse at the trial. Maybe I missed it. I could have missed it, right? I heard that she took responsibility for putting those logos on those reports that were given to the investors, took pharmaceutical logos without authorization, put it on reports that were provided to investors and potential investors upon, I assume they relied, and several testified that they did, before they made the decision to invest in Theranos. Where's the remorse? Where is it? Where is it in this motion? That's why I think she's going to speak at the hearing. There's one thing about taking responsibility for your mistakes. There's a whole nother story for when you say that you're sorry or you take responsibility for any harm that was caused. You don't have to admit, right? But whatever harm that was, whatever harm that was caused, CEOs do this all the time when they have products that fail, all the time. I didn't hear it from Ms. Holmes. Then they talk about the real Elizabeth Holmes is a compassionate friend who's there for people around her, blah, blah, blah. You can go ahead and read this. She's a devoted mother. The real Elizabeth Holmes is extremely genuine, giving, and selfless. And by the way, back also to what else is missing, there's no mention in this memorandum of her being currently pregnant. Why is that? Maybe she's not pregnant. Maybe I'm wrong about that. The real Miss Holmes was an approachable, attentive, and supportive employee, not according to Erica Chung, not according to several people who testified at the trial, not according to Tyler Schultz, right? Not according to many people that testified in that trial. The real Elizabeth Holmes faced the challenges, right? Well, where's the real Elizabeth Holmes has great remorse for any pain that could have potentially happened here or did happen, any losses to the investors, the impact on the patients. All right, so the judge, here's the test. The judge to fashion a sentence, this is underline 19, fashion a sentence sufficient but not greater than necessary. Okay, a sufficient sentence but not greater than necessary. But they are saying, Elizabeth Holmes and the defense is saying 18 months or less, that's appropriate, that's sufficient. And to allow her to continue her current service work, where she's doing the helpline on the Rape Crisis Center, and I'll get to that too. All right, they're talking about the real person, and they're talking about no defendant should be made a martyr to public passion. A martyr to public passion. They're saying because of the way the media is portraying her. What about what happened at the trial? What about the evidence? What about all the videos that I've done where we went through and I showed you? Look at the text messages. If you want to look at 2 videos, go look at text messages on the revealing texts video, and look at the other one about the, I think it's a whistleblower text. And you can see how this compassionate, this humble, this honest person, according to all these people who love and support her, how she responded and how they tried to figure out, she and Balwani tried to figure out who these whistleblowers were and how she responded when Walgreens found out that they were no longer doing the finger stick text. Look at that text. It rings through my head about her saying, present well. What does present well mean? Other than to offer a vision or a portrayal that is not reality, right? All right, so you can go ahead and read this through childhood, blah, blah, blah. This I thought was interesting. Miss Holmes was also a source of support within her own family. And I have no doubt this has been very painful for her partner, for her family, for her extended family. It's a terrible thing, okay, that has taken place here. That someone is on trial, someone has been convicted, right? Her father describes how when Enron collapsed during Miss Holmes' senior year in high school, her father, who worked at Enron, lost his job, savings, and healthcare. Terrible thing. Enron, if you know anything about Enron, I think it is the largest financial fraud case out there, or it was, and her father worked at that company. Okay, moving on here. Then they talk about the rape, and you know, it's a terrible thing. You know, she's saying that she was raped in college. Terrible, terrible thing. Ms. Holmes, she also testified she was raped. Ms. Holmes experienced acute self-blame, isolation, and depression, and struggled with suicidal thoughts. Her demeanor instantly changed. It's tragic. A coping mechanism Ms. Holmes devoted, as a coping mechanism, she devoted all of her energy and focus into starting a company. She became withdrawn, less social, and mono-focused on the next venture. After her rape, she was both broken and resolute, using her anger and her hurt as an impetus to make changes she so strongly believed in. One of the things that happens when you're raped other than the horrible devastation, is that you want your control back. You want power back. You want your power back. So here she is, where she focused all of her energy. And again, I'm not a professional here. I'm just saying, based on what I know, having prosecuted and dealt with many of these cases over my career, the drive for regaining control of your life. So she drops out of Stanford, right? Red flag, drops out of Stanford, starts this company, devotes many, many years, works no doubt very hard. But the question is, did she commit fraud? Did she make misrepresentations? The jury found that she did. And here's another thing I want to say, and it's very sensitive. So here she is, post-conviction. She has now volunteered and she has got certified as a rape crisis counselor. She's a rape victim, right? According to this memo, according to her testimony in trial. Should someone who has been raped, and it doesn't appear, I don't know, it doesn't appear, it's not in any of these 130 letters. This is to what's missing here, one of the things that's missing. There's no letter from any therapist saying that she's done any work regarding her rape, yet she's out there counseling. Maybe there is, I don't know. I thought that was interesting. Then after her rape, she, reconnects with Balwani, who's apparently 20 years older, has a relationship with him. 10 years later, when they both get indicted, she's claiming abuse, right? Which is, according to several of these letters, she apparently did talk about it to several of her friends and to her assistant. And I'll show you that letter in a second. So in the wake of, this is her, I cut this here because I had to get some of these pages. Anyway, Mr. Balwani's abuse involves severe sexual elements that cause Miss Holmes particular distress, including the thoughts of suicide. Okay, these events occurred in the home they shared, right? Because I didn't see them in the text messages. In the trial, they presented some evidence, her testimony, as well as a personal note, I think was from her iPhone, where she talked about, you know what, I think I'll do a separate video on that. But I did address some of it in the revealing text messages video. You can take a look at that. But anyway, she's claiming, that she was under a tremendous amount of stress. She was in a intimate partner violence, a domestic violence relationship. There was severe sexual elements to it. How did that impact her? How did that impact her judgment? There's no doubt. There's plenty of research out there. When you're in a domestic violence relationship, or today they call it an intimate partner violence, right? It messes with you quite a bit, right? Your judgment. Here she is trying to keep this company going. She's a CEO making a lot of decisions, and in allegedly a toxic relationship, an abusive relationship. The severe abuse Ms. Holmes suffered at the hands affected her deeply, including her role as a CEO of Theranos. Why is this important? Because part of being in a conspiracy is a willing participant. Well, if you're being abused, coerced, influenced by Balwani, are you willing? Did they meet the element of conspiracy? Well, they didn't present any domestic violence expert at the trial to say this impacted her, yet they're arguing this for sentencing. And here's another thing that's missing. Nowhere in these 130 pages is there a letter from any therapist, from any counselor, from any domestic violence expert to say, I met with Elizabeth Holmes. She told me the history. It's my opinion. That could have been something they submitted as part of this sentencing memo. No, instead they argue and they cite to all these studies to say that she's a victim of domestic violence. She may well be. but she could also be a fraudster. She could also be a visionary. Okay, but the letter is not included. There's not one letter from any counselor or therapist to say that they identify her as a domestic violence or a victim of intimate partner violence. Why is that? The fact that the abusive, this is line 8, the fact that the abusive dynamic affected their workplace relationship, and the fact that Ms. Holmes deferred to Mr. Balwani, especially in areas where he was formally responsible, is consistent with the research on intimate partner abuse. The fact? It's not a fact. This is what you're arguing. Where's the fact that she was? Where is the evidence? Where's the expert? Where's a letter from an expert? Just my opinion here. Typically, that's what you see when in sentencing memos. I've seen it, memos and probation reports. I've gone through all this in cases I've tried, okay? It erodes when you're in these relationships, it erodes an individual's capacity for independent decision-making and personal agency. I get that. Okay, volunteer work. They're also saying here's another reason she was, what happened to her at college, her relation, her alleged domestic violence relationship with Balwani, and now volunteer work. These are reasons why the judge should give her leniency and give her home detention. Her volunteer work. She's worked to find ways to continue contributing to the world. She's asked about how her skills can be used for good. She's got herself certified as a rape crisis counselor. Great. Okay, that's great. After her conviction, certified as a rape crisis counselor and advocate after her conviction. So I say, here's what I say to that, is that where's the evidence? She's deeply interested in changing, making the world a better place. They do talk about 2 campaigns, where I think it was Save the Children, or she did a fundraising or something when she was younger. Where's the list of donations to Save the Children or to a food, pantry, or to, an animal shelter, or starting a foundation? I mean, it looks like she was just focused on Theranos. Where's this long history of being someone who's, again, this is my opinion, and maybe it's there, maybe they just didn't include it. Okay, now here's the part, now we're going to get to the law here about, let me make sure, I got to look at my notes here. Let's see. All right, so also I wanted to point out, this is the last thing I was going to talk about as far as what else is missing, is there's nothing in here about the harm or the impact, or even mentioning the harm, potential impact to patients, to the investors, and we'll get to something I thought that was very interesting they said about the investors, but we'll get to that. All right, so let's get to calculation. And as I, pointed out in the prior videos, this is going to be a battle of how the judge calculates the loss. And why that matters is because if it's wrongly calculated, convictions can be reversed and tossed out. So the judge has to be very careful, and I have no doubt this judge will be very careful on how he calculates the sentence and how he specifically identifies his calculations to support the sentence that he sentences Elizabeth Holmes to. All right, but here's where the defense is responding to and asking the judge to basically, and to paraphrase, judge, don't look at the sentencing guidelines. Don't do the math. It doesn't apply to Elizabeth Holmes. That's basically what they're arguing here. So they're saying the calculation of the sentencing guidelines range and the objections to the pre-sentence report. And again, a lot of it's redacted because it's not publicly available as to what is being recommended by the probation department, right? So they're redacting what it is, but it looks like it's a lengthy prison sentence. And again, we don't have the response yet from the prosecution, what their recommendation is. So she objects to how the calculation of loss is done. She objects to increasing the offense level. Yeah, of course she does. She doesn't want to spend more time in prison. She's saying that the loss is unhelpful. The loss, the $144 million is unhelpful. Again, judge, don't pay attention to the loss. Don't do the math. I don't know what's under these redacted parts. They're saying that calculating the loss is complex. Yeah, I don't know that it is. You know, Brian Grossman lost 38 million on behalf of the PFM fund. The DeVos family lost 99 million. The who is it? Mosley lost 6 million. Added up, it's roughly 144 million. That's a start on the economic loss. You apply, and I'll show you this. It's right here. Here's the sentencing table, right? From the sentencing guidelines. Fraud, start at level 7. Now, they want you to do 18 months. Okay, so let me back up here and then I'll go back to it. So they're basically saying, if you look here, zone C, 12 to 18 months based on no criminal history, 12 to 18 months, that puts it at level 13. But what I have been calculating is above, you do the math here. Let me see if I can go back here. So you do the math, it's 7 for the felony, plus the amount, the 144 million, you add either 24 or 26, that takes her to 31 at a minimum. You know, then you can increase it, the number of victims, her leadership role, etc. So then that brings you to over here, which is where I'm sure the prosecution and the probation department is looking more at, is around level 31, level 35, 36, somewhere around there. But no, the defense wants the judge, you know, if you're going to apply the sentencing guidelines, judge, just apply level 13. And level 13 works out to defrauding basically what? No more than $40,000? Is that what they're arguing here? All right, so let's go back to the memo. So they're also arguing that the prosecution can't prove by clear and convincing evidence what conduct led to what of these count, you know, which one of these counts, and whether or not what conduct would justify enhancing her sentence. You talk about which standard applies. It's difficult in conspiracy cases. You know, judge, it's difficult to do these calculations. It's difficult to determine what conduct was part of the conviction. Well, I'll tell you this, the jury didn't have any problems. They convicted her on those 4 counts. The investor loss must be considered separately. Okay, I don't know how helpful that argument's going to be. They're arguing that none of the C1 investors who testified at trial were provided any of the financial models. Therefore, they didn't rely on these financial models that she provided before they invested in Theranos. But that backfires, right? Because if they were arguing, and they did at trial, that Balwani was in charge of financials. Well, then if Balwani was in charge of the financials, why did she get convicted? I mean, if you're saying they didn't rely on the financials, then they must have been relying on the representations that Elizabeth Holmes made. Again, we don't know what the jury, we don't know what was in their heads, why they made the decision they made. Because the circumstance of each investment is different, therefore this is really complex. The judge won't be able to do the calculation. Okay. Then they're saying that at trial, the government wasn't required to prove causation or reliance on any particular investment. Well, that's what cross-examination is for the defense. When Lisa Peterson, on behalf of our RDV, the DeVos family, is on the stand, you have plenty of opportunity, both sides do, to ask, what are you relying on when you made that decision to invest in Theranos? You could ask Mosley the same question. That's what cross-examination is about. If you're the defense, you pick apart what they relied on. Okay, for example, Lisa Peterson, she testified that she read the Forbes article, right? You pick apart what they looked at. Okay, did you see any of her presentations? Okay, you read the Forbes article. You relied on this X, Y, and Z. So then in closing argument, you say, well, there's reasonable doubt. And again, all due respect to counsel here, okay? It's their case. They try it however they want to try it. But one of the things that could have been argued is Lisa Peterson testified that she read the Forbes article, that she, watched all these videos. She went to these conferences where Elizabeth Holmes spoke. She, all the other things that she relied on other than what Elizabeth Holmes told her, right? So then you can say, how do we know, ladies and gentlemen? There's reasonable doubt there that the DeVos family could have made their decision based on something other than what Elizabeth Holmes told them. You see what I'm getting at? All right. So again, this could have been dealt with at trial. It cannot be assumed that any of the sophisticated, wealthy investors who knew about the risks but proceeded to invest anyway would say that they relied on projections. Well, you could have asked them at the trial. Okay, you can go ahead and read this. Loss requires a showing. Again, I don't think this is going to be very persuasive. Under number 3, the entirety of each investment is not appropriate measure of loss. Yeah, I don't know about that. And they're saying, Theranos wasn't a Ponzi scheme. I think some people might disagree with you on that. But anyway, unlike a Ponzi scheme, Theranos was a real company. It was recognized as innovative by the US Patent and Trademark Office. Just because you get patents doesn't mean that you have a legitimate company. Does it? Maybe I'm mistaken. But there are indicators of substantial value because they're arguing because the company still had value, that somehow that is a mitigating factor for the fraud. What about the money that the investors lost? And the other investors that the jury was undecided on, and the patients who walked into Walgreens trying to figure out what was going on with their health, submitted to a blood test, and maybe there was a doctor out there, gosh forbid, who relied on those results, turned out to be accurate, turned out to be inaccurate, I should say, right? And they made determinations on prescriptions that maybe they modified that patient's prescription. We don't know what happened. We do know at the trial that there were several, I think there were a nurse assistant, and I think there was a doctor too, who testified that they had the test rerun because they saw that there was something abnormal in the results. All right, so keep going here. Let's see. And, back to this, why are they saying 18 months? Did they just come up with this? And one of the questions that one of you asked, let's see. Was whether or not, I'm trying to read my notes here, whether or not, counsel should, do we tell our clients, you have a slim to none chance of getting home detention here, to getting 18 months, or is it because they're just trying to continue the delusion of their client? That was one of the questions that was asked, and I'll get to, I can't find where it is, but the counsel here is showing that they're relying on United States versus Block. They're relying on an actual case where a federal judge sentenced a defendant, a CFO in a publicly traded real estate investment trust, this is line 12, who brazenly inflated values. There was $300 million loss, and that defendant got an 18-month sentence. So the defense is relying on a prior sentence made by a different judge in a different jurisdiction. It's New York. That defendant got 18 months. So therefore, Elizabeth Holmes should get 18 months. Okay, then they argue another reason that she should get leniency here is she didn't gain from any of this. And again, I already mentioned the fact that she did take a salary, right? There was gain there. It's not required for fraud, but she got 1.5 million in salary over 6 years. That's pretty good money, right, for most people? All right, if the court accepts the calculation of loss, they would request a downward departure. Okay, Judge, so if you're going to look at that guidelines, that sentencing table I showed you, we still want a downward departure. Why? I don't know, because it's blacked out. Ms. Holmes objects to the calculation of the number of victims because the more victims there are, they could increase the amount of time that she would serve. So it indicates to me that, as I said earlier, could she get the same sentence? That video I did, could she get the same sentence on Balwani? The court could consider all the conduct, the counts that she was acquitted on regarding the patients, the 3 investor counts that they were undecided on, as well as in the 4 counts that she was convicted on. You can add up all those victims, right? And if it's over 10, they can increase the sentencing, takes you down even 2 more levels, all right? And again, we don't know, a lot of this is blacked out. And they're saying that you can increase her role, you can increase the amount of prison time or her sentence if you can say that she was a leader or manager. I went over that. Go back to my very first video I did on calculating the loss. If they can show that she was a leader or manager, they can also add even more prison time, the lengthy incarceration. Again, we don't know because it's blacked out here. Then they're saying, they're asking the court to not presume the guideline range is reasonable. Well, gee, that's a new theory. I'm sure many defendants have tried that. When the sentence is, the court has to look at all the factors. I went over this in one of the prior videos. And they're saying she's been convicted of defrauding certain sophisticated investors who knew they were investing in a company with a big world-changing dream. So therefore, it doesn't matter? Is that what they're saying? Are you blaming it on the victims here? Is that what that is? Because they were sophisticated investors? Does that mean you get a free pass? She worked constantly, never sold any stock, and remained firmly committed. I get it. She was committed, dedicated. She spent days in her room putting a patent application together. She was going to make this work. She was determined. I don't know if what happened when she was in high school and her father lost everything. I don't know if that impacted her, that she was never going to fail, never going to fail. Okay, and I know that it creates a lot of dedication, a lot of tenacity to make your dream a reality. But the jury found that she committed fraud. Is the judge supposed to look the other way because of sophisticated investors? Just because you're sophisticated, you don't get to sign away fraud, right? You don't get to have people say, I invest in the company and you also agree to assume any risk if I make any fraudulent statements about it. Is that what they're saying here? And they're also saying because of the environment, she should also be given a pass. It was a unique world of investments in startup companies. And there's letters of these 130 letters. They talk about how difficult it is, especially for women, for female entrepreneurs. I get it, ladies. I'm a lawyer, right? I went to law school. I tried my first cases. I was not allowed to wear pants in the courtroom. Okay, that's how old I am. All right. So things have changed, but you don't get to blame it on, or do you? That it was a rough and tumble world, therefore I should be given a pass. And that, one of the investors said, failure is part of the game. Yeah, failure is. You take a great risk. It takes a lot of courage. I get it. But you don't get to commit fraud in order to get your dream. It is common sense that investing in any uncertain venture brings with it a substantial risk. Yes, but does it also bring the risk of being lied to? Think about who she targeted. She targeted wealthy families, right? Those are the people that look at who she put on her board. She didn't put, I think there was one person who had some medical experience. Look at the people who are on her board. Secretary of State, we had George Shultz, we had Mad Dog Mattis, we had a senator, we had people in the military, people in politics. Why? Why wasn't there anybody who actually worked in this field? Blood testing. You know, where were those people? Lisa Peterson testified in the trial. You know what she said when she knew not to ask Elizabeth questions about all of this, because then they wouldn't be allowed to to invest in Theranos. And I think it was Mosley who talked about how they were looking for the right kind of, the right kind of people to be investing with, something to that effect. Okay. Why weren't they asking people who were in the healthcare industry and doing this kind of work to be the investors? 90% of startups fail. Okay, great. But this company failed because the technology didn't work. Ms. Holmes' conduct should also be considered in the context of this world, filtered through her role as a young, first-time founder without independent business experience. Well, she had no experience, no MBA. Her first job, right here, I'll show you this. Let's see. This is back, this is one of the letters. I only picked two because there's so many, or three of them. Here's a letter from a gentleman who worked at Theranos in September 2005 to November 2006. He knew then, because he said she worked very hard. She was a pioneer. She did demonstrations in Europe with investors and manufacturers in China. He said, I also noticed that she did not have much experience in management. This is back in 2005. Her first real job was at a startup. Her first real job was to be a CEO of a startup. And she gets a pass for that? Some of the managers were not from the biotech industry. Their understanding of the development process and timeline might not really make too much sense. There were many problems that were overlooked. And there was a systemic management problem due to her inexperience. He knew that back then. I'm sure many of her family members, many of the people that wrote these letters also knew she had no experience. It was pointed out in several of these letters. Here's another letter I want to show you. This is a letter from, I think it's a closest friend of the family for over 50 years. Elizabeth Holmes, he said, had a single-minded pursuit of what she deemed important, making her dream a reality. Look at what happened to her in college. If she was raped, rape victims. You want your power back. You want to be seen. You want some control. You want to build something because your whole life has been devastated by this, right? That's commonly what happens to rape victims. It's a terrible, terrible thing. He said, after reading her first perspective, I asked if I could make an investment. She agreed, even though she was pursuing large investors, not small ones like me. I do remember having concerns back then whether the technological problems could be overcome. So they knew back then that there were technological problems, and whether her youth and lack of any business experience could become issues. Well, unfortunately, they did. She was very young and seemingly a vulnerable female. Okay, vulnerable female. She was over 30 when she was taking in these investor monies, these 144 million, of which she was convicted of. She was in her 30s, okay? A vulnerable female wading into a ruthless male-dominated industry. Okay. All right. In retrospect, it is clear she lacked any experience. In retrospect, again, this is just my opinion. It is also involves a delicate balance. On one hand, the entrepreneur must present an upbeat story to potential investors. Is that what he thinks this was, an upbeat story to potential investors? You know, that the technology does in fact work when actually it didn't? Tyler Schultz, watch that video I did on Tyler Schultz calls out Elizabeth Holmes. He sent her those scatter plots that showed that the results were not reliable. Many people testified. He also said at the same time, according to this letter, the entrepreneur must describe accurately. That's true, and be candid. Where has Elizabeth Holmes been candid? She had no intention to defraud. Well, the jury found differently. At worst, she is a young woman who made serious mistakes in her zeal to succeed. Well, she wasn't 19, she was in her 30s. She was stealth with the company for many years. And when she was taking in the money that she was convicted of, she was in her 30s. Okay, back to the memo. So, inventing the future is hard. You see how they're minimizing what happened here? They're, blaming, shifting the blame, whether it's Balwani, whether it's what happened to her in college, whether it's getting, bad advice in some of these letters. They're saying she got bad advice, whether it's because she wasn't experienced. These challenges are only complicated by female founders. Okay, so it's because she's a woman. Speaking as a woman, it's again one of these letters who was a woman who raised 60 million. One of her friends raised 60 million from a venture capital. I can confirm it's not easy. Only 3% of the VC money goes to women. I understand that. It's similar to what happens in the law practice. How many women are managing partners who actually make decisions in law firms? Why is it that so many women start their own law firms? I get it. I understand it. All right. But is that really the circumstance that Elizabeth Holmes faced? She had George Shultz on her board. She had Mad Dog Mattis on her board. She had senators on her board. She raised I think it was over $900 million. Is that not it was not easy for Elizabeth Holmes? And we should give her a pass? I mean, look at who she was surrounded by. Look at who invested in Theranos. Elizabeth Holmes did a terrific job of raising money, right? She did a terrific job of selling a vision. Problem is, it didn't work. And the jury found that she didn't tell the truth. The nuanced elements of Elizabeth being a female CEO cannot be overstated. What? I mean, I'm sorry, but is that sexist? Or I don't know. Yeah, it's a reality, okay? But did it really apply to Elizabeth Holmes? You can go ahead and read the rest of this. It's valuable technology. No doubt, putting it out there, creating that idea had value. But that's not what she was tried for. She was tried on whether or not she made misrepresentations. People relied on it. It turned out those representations were a lie. Theranos was on its way of achieving a mission. Great. But what does that have to do with whether or not she committed fraud? Employed hundreds of employees. Great. What does it have to do with her committing fraud? The company had substantial value. It wasn't worthless. They were able to sell, I think they got $100 million in a fire sale on these patents. She didn't personally profit. She never sold any of her stock back. I said this earlier. They don't sell their stock because you don't want to lose control of the company. You don't have to profit. It's not required to be convicted of fraud. The guidelines are unhelpful. The court should decline to impose any sentence primarily driven by the loss calculation. What? The sentencing table doesn't apply to Elizabeth Holmes? No help to any judge in fashioning a sentence that is fair, just, and reasonable. Yeah, judge, throw out the sentencing guidelines that you apply every day to every other defendant that walks into your courtroom. The loss table frequently produces arbitrary and unduly severe sentences. It applies every day across all the federal district courts to defendants all over the country. Judges apply the sentencing guidelines. Yes, they're advisory. and they're not mandatory. But we don't want you to apply it in this case. Why? Because of who Elizabeth Holmes is? Is that it? Ms. Holmes' personal history and characteristics strongly support leniency. And this is back to what I said. If ever a person is to receive credit for the good she's done, what about the risk to the patients? What about the risk to those people who relied? We don't know who relied on those results. What about the risk that these investors took? Yes, I know it's a high stakes and there's a great likelihood of losing your money. And her immediate conduct assessed in the context of the overall life. It should be a moment out of her sentencing when her future hangs in the balance. Compassionate, honest, and humble woman with so much to give to the world. You know, who's the audience on this memo is this judge. You think the judge is going to be persuaded by this? What was the point of putting this memorandum together by putting all this in there? I don't think it's going to be helpful to Elizabeth Holmes. You can go ahead and read this. She's no danger to the public, blah, blah, blah. Well, I think many people would disagree with you on that. She's had to move several times, again, portraying her as a victim. It's damaged her life. It's punished her. Her family's being punished. It's a terrible thing, right? All the stuff that's happened. When you get indicted and when you get convicted, this is what happens. Talking about a civil death. Forever, she's going to be paying the punishment for this. So, judge, just let her keep on living the lifestyle she has. Let her have home detention. Let her keep counseling, rape victims. Let her, do a significant amount of community service, but don't put her in prison. Don't put her there. She doesn't belong there, Your Honor. Is that what they're saying? Incarceration is unnecessary and unhelpful to Ms. Holmes? She doesn't, what are you saying? She doesn't need to be held accountable and treated like every other defendant? Just punishment is not served by a lengthy incarceration. Well, many very wise people before us determined that it is. There's a reason we have prison. The reason we have prison for people who don't, in particular, take any accountability for their actions. The prosecutorial and cultural focus on punishing Ms. Holmes stands out. She's being treated differently, therefore, we need to apply her sentence differently. They talk about Adam Newman, who was a founder of WeWork, who was accused of diverting millions. Mr. Newman walked away from his company. He recently received a $350 investment. So in other words, Elizabeth Holmes, because she's not able to get money, she gets a pass. There shouldn't be any discrepant treatment. Well, that's exactly what you're asking for. Ms. Holmes has borne the brunt of the vitriol. Yeah, well, she also, she had to deal with the prosecution with the SEC, settling other cases. I don't know if there was a plea deal offered here. She had 7 days on the stand. And again, this is my opinion. She had 7 days on the stand to look to the jury and say, hey, I screwed up. Yeah, I did the logos. And by the way, it's something you could have done, prosecution could have done here. And again, all due respect, it's their case. They try it the way they want it. When she admitted, whenever a defendant admits something, you freeze frame, you stop, and you say, okay, let me ask a bunch of questions here. Elizabeth Holmes admits the logo, right? She admits she puts the logo on these reports, these studies and stuff that were given to the investors that several investors testified they relied upon. At that moment, that's when you say to Elizabeth Holmes, okay, so what was the process of you doing these logos? So I imagine you got the reports from, Pfizer or whoever, I can't remember these days, on all these pharmaceutical names, right? So why don't you explain to the jury the process of how you took the logo from one document and you put it on another document? And during any time, how long did it take you to do that? Right? What was the whole process? Draw it out. Any time during that where you were misappropriating these logos, did it occur to you that you were misrepresenting an endorsement from, say, for instance, Pfizer? Did that ever occur to you? How's she going to answer that question, right? So Ms. Holmes, she's borne the brunt, and they say here some failures of judgment in her part. You know, they're admitting to something here. There were some failures in her judgment, some simply operational hurdles that she had to overcome. There were no doubt missteps. Again, minimizing, and that's what the defense does, right? They minimize the behavior. And they're singling, you know, saying that she's being singled out. It's a wake-up call for sexism in tech. Really? Is that really what this is about? Okay, and they're saying from 2015 to 2021, you look at the sentencing table, Zone D, throughout the jurisdiction, defendants got, you know, was 24 months. But again, go back to, I actually did it on the community page. You can look at, let's look at what this judge in particular sentenced. That's what's relevant, because they go on to cite all these other, you know, sentencing in federal courts in New York, okay? Why don't you look and distinguish what cases the judge sentenced on, this judge, you know, that I indicated on the community page. You know, I outlined 3 cases, showed you what the sentence was, how much was defrauded, and how, you know, I've argued in several videos that Elizabeth Holmes, the amount, the 144 million, far exceeds it, takes her down that sentencing table, right, that exposes her to a long sentence. All right, almost done here. You know, the touchstone of this factor is the idea of treating defendants who are found to have committed similar crimes similarly. Yeah, that's right. That's why they put out these guidelines. Although advisory, they wanted to make them consistent across all the federal courts, whether you're in New York or California, or you're in Missouri, or you're in Louisiana, or you're in Texas, or wherever. They wanted consistency. But what you're arguing in this memo is to say she shouldn't be treated differently. In fact, throw out the sentencing guidelines. Now they talk about restitution. They say basically she doesn't have the money to pay it. And they say it shouldn't be applied because it's not a case where the victims are vulnerable. Theranos did not solicit. Well, how about Elizabeth Holmes did not solicit investments from members of the general public? She was running around the country making all these presentations. She was getting all these articles and all these press publications, media publications. And here's what they say about the sophisticated wealthy investors. To the contrary, Theranos investors were required to represent that they were sophisticated. They understood the limiting operating history and the uncertain future of the company, and that they could afford to lose. They actually said this. They could afford to lose their entire investment without suffering financial harm. Therefore, doesn't matter that they lost 144 million, and not to mention the other investors, that the jury was undecided. Oh, it's because you have a certain amount of money that we have the right to defraud you? Is that what they're arguing here? Wow. I guess the law applies differently. Is that what they're saying? Sentences apply differently depending on who you are and who you take money from. Second, she didn't personally benefit from the investments. Well, I respectfully disagree. Ms. Holmes does not have the assets to pay restitutions to any investors. Well, I have no doubt that Elizabeth Holmes is working on her next patent, her next invention. She's going to make something of herself, right? She's going to build her next empire. She's going to redeem herself, no doubt. If she's learning anything in this counseling, right? She's out there helping rape victims turn their lives around. But you have to also transform your own life too, right? When you go through something like this. I don't think this memo demonstrates that she has made those transformations, that she has sought out the help to address whatever the circumstances were that led her to defraud people, to allow technology, according to these people who testified, to the witnesses. The witnesses who testified that it was clearly unreliable, to the text messages that she was having with Balwani when he was telling her. He called her out. He told her, Walgreens knows. And she said, present well. She said, in other words, don't tell him that we're not using finger stick. Present well. Who uses that term? Ms. Holmes' capacity to do good supports community service. She had a deeply held desire to make the world a better place. Her self-reflection. Well, I didn't see it on the stand. I didn't see where she demonstrated an awareness of the gravity of the harm that had been caused to these investors, to these patients, to whoever else. The remorse, I didn't see it. In her visionary and creative mind, leave her with the capacity and the potential to positively contribute to the world. Well, let's see if there's anything else here. They want her to continue to support sexual assault survivors, to assist in the helpline. It's a better use of her society resources than incarcerating her. Such approach would allow her to fulfill the promise of Senator Booker. I mean, come on. Of criminal justice reform and restorative justice. That's great. Very admirable, right? In the end, we have an intelligent, fearless woman who took a huge project that should have changed the world, and she nearly succeeded. Well, but the jury found she committed fraud along the way. She openly acknowledges her business mistakes. Okay, but did she openly acknowledge? Did she acknowledge her remorse? Her suffering. As one Fred said, I am confident that on the other side of this, Elizabeth will do amazing things for society with her talents and boundless passions, for changing the world for the better. I bet she will. Truly, I bet she will. I hope that she learns from this, but it just hasn't been demonstrated, in my opinion. And frankly, I don't see why she can't do all this help while she's in prison, right? Helping all the other women that she's incarcerated with. She's now a certified counselor, right? Hopefully she's getting and addressing her own issues. I assume there's issues. Someone who drops out of Stanford, who's been raped, who's been traumatized in a toxic, allegedly domestic violence relationship. I assume there's healing to be done there. But the thing is, the judge has to make a determination on what the appropriate sentence is. And I think the defense is asking for Elizabeth Holmes to be treated differently and to be given leniency. And I think that starts with taking accountability for what has happened, to expressing remorse. And I don't think that's there. I don't think we've heard it. And that's why she may speak at the hearing. So, as you can tell, I'm done talking. I hope I addressed enough. Wait, let me quickly show you. Let me see if I can show you quickly one other thing here. Here's the letter from her assistant, who talks that Elizabeth was isolated. Well, they also say that she was isolated as a reaction to being raped, withdrawing, etc. Her assistant saying she witnessed how hard it was for Elizabeth to leave, and that Balwani, according to her assistant, would isolate her. She didn't act with malicious intent, according to this assistant. I saw her behave kindly, and how much Balwani controlled and dominated her, and that she was involved in an abusive relationship. That's what the assistant said. But I think it's a far cry, right? If that's true, there was no domestic violence expert at the trial. There's no letters to substantiate any of that by any domestic violence expert. None of the 130 letters. And so I wanted to show you this last part, which is, the defense is asking for a level 6, right? So they want the judge to go from, which I'm sure, which is the lengthy prison sentence the probation is probably recommending. No doubt the prosecution will be arguing 108 on up, They want the judge to forget about all that and jump to the 12 to 18 months. Let her stay at home, live the lifestyle she's living. Nothing changes in her life. She can keep on doing rape counseling, living where she's living, having the lifestyle she has. Forget about prison judge, because Elizabeth Holmes should be given significant leniency. I don't think the judge is going to buy it. I don't. And I think Elizabeth Holmes is looking at significant prison time. So what do you think? What do you think the judge is going to do? Do you think the judge is going to be persuaded by this memo? By the fact that she's a female entrepreneur and it's difficult to raise that kind of money? Or that she was in an, allegedly an abusive relationship. She was raped in college. Terrible, terrible, traumatic things that have happened. But I watched her testify. I watched that trial. And, maybe it's because of my experience. Maybe I look at it differently. But I've certainly argued many sentencing on behalf of many of my clients. And I've certainly read and argued for and against many recommendations. I don't think the judge is going to buy it. I don't think the judge is going to throw out the sentencing guidelines. So, what's your analysis? Please do leave a comment or question. Thanks again to all of you who have subscribed. Thanks again to all of you who have contributed. I really appreciate it to me making these videos. Please hit that like button, share these videos, do leave a comment, and thanks again for watching.